Good morning everybody, welcome back to the channel. And I thought this week I would just do a very quick general thoughts video of the game Lincoln. As you can see, the box next to me here. I got it out for the first time with the guys on Friday at club night, and frankly I thought we had a blast with it. We really enjoyed it. It was a cracking little game. It's one I bought on Board Game Geek a few months ago. Haven't had a chance to get it to the table, but I thought I would just share my thoughts, overview of the game. I would say this game is a cross between a board game and a war game. Probably more board game, but it's got some nice chrome. It's very simplistic, but it does give you some really nice tactical decision making as well. Excuse me. So it's a game published by Worthington. It was produced by Plastic Soldier Company along with Martin Wallace. It's one of the Martin Wallace stock of games. I've got several of his. I do like his different mechanics and things that he puts with his games. And of course it's American Civil War, so what's not to like? One of my favourite periods. So in the box you get a couple of rules books, which is nice if you're playing two players. On Friday, two of the guys played. I kind of assisted, but really sort of looked at the rules and things like that. But the rules aren't complicated. You're probably talking about 15 pages in real terms. Probably the time you chuck out sort of the general bits and pieces, that's probably a bit less than that. But it's nice, it's full colour, some nice examples of play, and as I say, it's not complicated. So the aim of the game, very simply, this is a grand scale sort of strategic game. Really, I would say it's covering the whole American Civil War, although it's not dividing it down into years or months or anything like that. Principally, I'd say that because of the way the fundamental card mechanic works in the game. And this is a card destruction mechanic, and this is very much the heartbeat of the game. I'll come on to that a bit more at the moment, but you've got this very nice mounted board. Hopefully you can sort of certainly see a little bit of that in the video. Some nice elements to that. I'll show some bits and pieces of that in with the video, so you can see kind of how that works. But fundamentally, the aim of the game is for the Union player to get 12 victory points by the time he gets to the end of his deck after his second shuffle. And this is where I think the kind of time span of the war comes in, because what happens, both players, when they run out of cards, they will reshuffle and they will add in new cards from a couple of different decks, and they'll do that twice. The Confederate player can then keep reshuffling as many times as he needs to as he runs out of cards, but to end the game, once the Union player runs out of cards after the second reshuffle, then that's when the game would end and he would need to have 12 victory points. After the first reshuffle, he'd need 2, and after the second one he would need 5, and then when the deck runs out, that's when he'd need his 12. So there's pressure on the Union player to grab these victory points throughout the game, and the key areas where you can do that are capturing territory, enforcing the blockade, and blocking supply lines. I think they're probably the 3 key areas. So you've got these railroad links across the map, and as long as you've got supply, you can do most things. As soon as you cut supply, things go bad very, very quickly. Likewise, certain areas have greater defense properties depending on which direction you're coming in on the railroad. Some have none, and each area is divided into two halves. So if you occupy that area and an enemy comes in, you automatically assume to move into the area where the enemy is advanced. But likewise, if you want to pull back, you can give ground and pull into the second part of that area without giving up the terrain area itself. That can be really helpful, and that was an important dynamic in the game, deciding when to fight, when to give ground, when to give up ground completely sometimes, and we saw that work in several ways. So they're the key mechanics. Probably in our game we didn't spend a lot of time, certainly the Union player didn't spend a lot of time building the naval blockade, because it is quite expensive in terms of card count, and if you don't get the right cards you can't do that. But it'd be very interesting to see how that works, because as you go up the blockade scale on the board, the Union player can grab victory points and reduce the number of starting cards that the Confederate player has. And this is where perhaps a dynamic of things like command and colours comes into play, where each player will have a hand of cards. The Union player always has 6. The Confederate player starts with 5, but that could be reduced throughout the game. So as supply issues come into play, attrition, the Confederate player throughout the war indirectly gets weaker, whereas they're a lot stronger perhaps at the outset, or certainly on a par with the Union player. So it's a very nice balance there. The Confederate player has to decide to either build up reserves and supplies early on, hoping he can then last out, or go on the offensive early, try and grab some ground and then give slowly. The Union player probably wants to build up his strength, maybe start blockading, and then launch all out attacks as it gets later into the game to grab victory points. So it's a very nicely balanced game for both sides. Lots of dynamics in terms of how it works, but fundamentally it's as I say, a destructive card deck mechanism, and it's a card game. So you have these decks, as I say, there's some of them have got 1s and 2s on because that's when they get reshuffled in, but I just wanted to show you some of the cards and explain what they mean. So each card, hopefully you can see this, has potentially lots of information on it. You'll see these are very good quality. These are Confederate ones, so they have a grey tinge. The Union ones have a blue tinge. Information above this line is construction or building of armies, and sometimes it can also be used to influence Europe or the blockade. So if, for example, a Confederate player wants to influence the European track, he would have to burn this card permanently, and he'd have to pay another card out of his deck to the discard pile. So you discard cards, as I say, it's a destructive deck, which will get reshuffled, but those that you've burned are gone permanently. So of course, although you may want to influence Europe, looking below the line there may be other things on this card that you want to do instead. If you burn the card, you're never going to get to do those. If you discard, use it as a discard for something else, then you're not going to get it to do it that phase until you reshuffle and maybe get the card back in the deck again. So some really interesting dynamics there. And I've just explained some of these other icons. So the star represents a general or grade of general, which has an impact on combat modifiers, graded from 1 to 5. So 5 is obviously a very good rated general. Confederates tend to have better generals in the earlier part of the game and less of access to these later in the game, whereas the Union, it's the other way around. Additionally, you could also have action or benefit descriptions at the bottom, which again you could use. So this one, cotton bonds, it allows you to deploy 2 units from your hand. So in this case, if you've got 2 units at the top here, 2 separate cards that you'd like to get these, where in this case it's the Europe, but it could be an army, onto the table, you'd still burn the card, but you wouldn't have to discard other cards using the cotton bonds action. As a player, you have 2 actions that you can do each phase. So obviously if you're using cotton bonds in this case, that would be 1 action, and there's a list of things that you can do under the actions list. Just to show you some of the other cards and how they interact. So this one here, again, you've got an army at the top here, number 1 army. You don't have to, that's the only build or construction where you don't have to burn the card. You would actually just put that back in the discard to be recycled. You can see the number over here, number 2, means that that only goes into the deck at the 2nd shuffle, and then it will be in there permanently from there. Other cards, just for prosperity to show you this one, again a card that goes in at the 2nd shuffle. You can see for the Confederates, that card allows them to do absolutely nothing. So it's a totally invaluable card other than for discard purposes. But again, it just shows you, and this is the friction of the supply issues that the Confederates had later in the war. You start to get these cards which are going to affect the playability of your deck. This one, again, an interesting one. We've got a benefit at the bottom here, which is something you can use in the combat to give you a high ground terrain advantage. Likewise, you could instead use it for construction of a fort, which Confederates only have access to building forts at a cost, of course, but forts again add positive modifiers to the defense factors of the Confederate troops. We've got an example there of a 3-point army. That's the strongest you can get. Here you would have to burn the card and discard 2 cards to the discard deck as well. And you'll see here another emblem with a train on it, and that allows you to activate for movement either a stack of units in one space to an adjacent, or 1 unit to anywhere within its railroad supply network. So that's what you can use that for. And final card, again, just to show you this one, you can see again there's 3 options here to build an army, 5-star general, or the action is a cavalry raid. A cavalry raid forces your opponent to discard 2 cards from their hand randomly, but it can also be blocked by a fellow cavalry raid card if your opponent has that. So there are some other intricacies with the cards as well, but overall that gives you a flavour of how they work. You've got various actions, movement, as we've sort of covered there. You've got blockading, you've got continual combat where you're already in the same zone as an enemy, and other things that you can do there as well. Combat is very straightforward, very basic. This is a diceless system, so with combat you will tot up the number of armies for you and your opponent. When attacking, you have to discard another card from your hand face down. Now that card could be a leader for a leader value, or it could be just a random throwaway. That's your choice depending on how you want to influence that particular combat or not. But that card will then go to your discard pile as well. the defender will then choose whether to stand or retreat, or withdraw, either to the other half of the same box or out of the box completely. And then if they're standing and fighting, they can then add a leadership card face down. And of course you can also add other cards if you've got like the terrain factors and things like that, add modifiers. You will add on any modifiers on the actual square that you're on, because as I said, there's some defensive choke points, and you'll also add on the modifiers, things like forts, etc. as well. And basically, who's ever got the highest score will be the winner. Defenders will win ties, which we had a couple of times, but the winner will lose troops, half their troops rounded down, whereas defender will lose half their troops rounded up. So very, very straightforward, attritional kind of thing from that point of view. But very much the friction in the game is through the card play. Often you want to do various things with a particular card and you can't. You might have to sacrifice it or sacrifice other cards to enable you to do things. You can never do everything you want to do, and I think that's the key aspect of the game that makes this quite challenging and quite enjoyable from that point of view. As I say, we played for a couple of hours. We were learning the game as well. We were just about to get to the second reshuffle. At that point, the Union player had 8 victory points. Probably overall would say the Union player was more in the driving seat, looked like they're probably going to win, but there was still elements that were up for grabs, and we had some interesting combats down one side of the board from the Union. They took out Fort Henry, Corinth, Nashville, Vicksburg fell, so did New Orleans, but the Confederates were holding on to Chattanooga, Atlanta, Savannah, and they kind of built some very strong defensive areas there, so they were hoping to hold off the Union on that side. Meanwhile, on the other side, the Confederates had built up, after some initial loss of ground, had retaken Newmarket and Front Royal, and were building strength in Manassas and Front Royal, with possible options to move into Harper's Ferry, maybe Gettysburg, maybe Washington. But it was looking more likely the Confederates were going to be on the defensive, and more likely I think that the Union were going to get those extra 4 VPs at some point when they took Chattanooga, Atlanta and Savannah, which I think was probably their best route of success. So I think that gives you a kind of a good overview of the game we played. You'll have seen a few pictures flash up on the screen for different things. I'll show you some more at the end of the board, some of the cards, counters, etc. But that is Lincoln, a Martin Wallace game via PSC, produced by Worthington. For me, I think it was a very enjoyable few hours, and certainly one we'll get back out on the table. I think there's lots of strategies that you could follow in this game, and that's what makes it appealing. And there's a lot of replayability there, a lot of tactic and strategy there, but at the same time it's a very simple, easy to pick up game. We were up playing it very, very quickly, and I say had a very enjoyable game. But that's Lincoln. Hope you've enjoyed this video, and see you again next time.